It's Tuesday, January 13th, 2025. Welcome to Make It Make Sense. I'm Grant Herms. Today on the show, we're going to talk about a story that I think most people are going to blow right past this week because it sounds boring. What we're talking about is the Department of Justice opening a criminal investigation into the head of the Federal Reserve, Jerome Powell. And before you change this podcast, don't let the words Federal Reserve turn you off here, because what this is actually a story about is how much things cost and whether the president can control the economy like a king. I'll explain. But first, make sure you're following the show on whatever podcast app you listen to it on. If you're watching on YouTube, hit the subscribe button. It really helps the show out. Also, subscribe to the Make It Make Sense Substack, where this week's Things You Forgot from Civics class is all about knowing your rights when dealing with police and what the Constitution says about it. Because if knowing civics is about being a good citizen, then knowing your rights when you're confronted by a government agent is being a good citizen. But that newsletter is just for paid subscribers. You can sign up for the Make It Make Sense Substack at the link in the show notes. All right, when I come back, Trump's Fed fight and why it matters to you. It's January, which means half the country is doing dry January and the other half is asking, does wine count if I'm mad at the news? If you've ever tried dry January, you know the problem isn't willpower. It's standing in your kitchen at 9 p.m. holding a can of seltzer and promising yourself it's the same if you close your eyes and ignore your sense of taste. Well, that's where Reserve Collective botanical drinks come in. Reserve makes non-alcoholic beverages with plant-based ingredients, so you'll still get that feeling, just without the hangover, the regret, or waking up to text messages you don't remember sending. It still feels like a drink. It still feels like a ritual. You don't black out during the documentary you were pretending to watch. Dry January, at least for me, isn't about suffering or even really sobriety. It's about a reset at the beginning of the year after a few months of the holidays where we all rightfully celebrated. Right now, you can get 30% off your next order from Reserve Collective with the code in the show notes. Mims does get a cut of that, but it helps support the show stay up and running. So if you're doing dry January or you're just taking a break from alcohol, check out Reserve Collective Botanical Drinks. Same vibe, fewer apologies. All right, let's get on with the show. On Sunday, something unprecedented happened at the Federal Reserve. Now, that's not normally a thing you hear about the Fed. It's usually a pretty precedented kind of place. But what we got this week was a video from the chair of the Federal Reserve, Jerome Powell, announcing that he and some of his staff had been served grand jury subpoenas from the Department of Justice, meaning the DOJ has officially opened an investigation into the Federal Reserve. The DOJ says it's because of cost overruns on the renovation of the buildings that the Federal Reserve is in, but Powell has been one of Trump's favorite targets since he got back into the Oval Office. Here's what Trump had to say.
Well, he's billions of dollars over budget, so he either is incompetent or he's crooked. I don't know what he is, but he doesn't do a very good job.
And here's a bit of what Powell had to say that was so stunning.
The threat of criminal charges is a consequence of the Federal Reserve setting interest rates based on our best assessment of what will serve the public, rather than following the preferences of the president. This is about whether the Fed will be able to continue to set interest rates based on evidence and economic conditions, or whether instead monetary policy will be directed by political pressure or intimidation.
So I'll explain what he's talking about here in a minute, but it needs to be said that this is just not the kind of thing you get from the head of the Federal Reserve. A direct appeal to the people of the United States from the guy in charge of the policy around money. Normally, those guys work in the background. They have quarterly press conferences about interest rates, and occasionally they testify before Congress like Powell did back in June. We'll talk about that in a minute. But to make a public appeal like that is the economics equivalent of sending up a distress flare. Before I talk about what's being alleged here by the Department of Justice, I want to talk about the Fed. I think that most people hear that and really don't know what it does or maybe even really what it is, except for maybe it's a collection of the most boring people in Washington, and that is saying something. So I like to think of the Federal Reserve in two ways. The first is what it actually is, the country's central bank, meaning it's responsible for setting and making the policy around U.S. money, like raising or lowering overall inflation rates by setting interest rates on borrowing money. That's the 30,000-foot view of it, and that is enough, I hear you, to make your eyes glaze over. The second way, and the better way I think to think about it, is that the Fed is the part of the government that you and I interact with on a daily basis, usually without ever knowing, because the Fed is setting the price of what a dollar is and how much it costs to borrow one. And that ends up getting into every nook and cranny of the economy. It means things like interest rates on paying back home, car, student loans can change. It means the price for the things that we buy that come into the country can change. It means inflation rises or falls, making food and clothes and gas more expensive. It can even affect how much you get paid and whether that cost of living increase you hopefully get every year is actually keeping pace with the cost of living, which, spoilers, it really hasn't been lately. But what I'm getting at here is the Fed isn't just a group of 12 boring regional banks around the country, but something you physically interact with every day. I also want to talk about how this is made up. The Fed, or the Federal Reserve, is made of 12 banks that oversee the flow of money in specific regions across the country. Each one of those banks has a bank president, just like any other bank, who's appointed by a group of directors and confirmed by the 7 members of the Board of Federal Reserve Governors. Now, those governors are appointed by the President of the United States, confirmed by the Senate, and they serve 14-year terms each. That board includes and is led by the chair of the Federal Reserve, also nominated by the President of the United States and confirmed by the Senate. Now, they serve 4-year terms as chair. The current chair, Jerome Powell, was appointed by Trump in his first term and then reappointed by Biden. His current term ends in May. So, moving on here, what's the deal with this fraud investigation? Well, the Department of Justice, the Federal Housing Authority, and the President have all claimed that Powell is committing some kind of fraud in the renovation of 2 of the Federal Reserve's buildings in D.C. The renovations on these buildings, the main Fed building and one next door, have been extremely difficult. Both buildings were built in the 1930s and have needed upgrades for decades. Back in June, when Powell testified in front of the Senate and took Trump on a tour of the renovations, he said, quote, "I came to understand how badly the building really needed a serious renovation. It had never had one, it was not really safe, and it was not waterproof." So a pair of buildings that are nearly 100 years old hadn't been renovated, that would be expensive regardless of the building's historic status. But then you also add in the fact that D.C. is built on a swamp, which makes construction or renovations of any kind harder. You tack on the fact that D.C. buildings have strict height limits that have to do with monuments, so floors that are added are often underground when buildings are expanded, again, underground into a swamp, which happened here for a new parking garage. It's also worth noting here that the Fed buildings have had routine maintenance done on them, including a larger maintenance project in the 1990s, but no real overhaul renovation like this. And doing the kind of work that's been done has been so difficult that the construction company doing it won an award for excellence from the Washington Building Congress last year for how they handled just the parking garage, and they're probably up for it again for the rest of it. So then back in July, Powell wrote a letter to the head of the Office of Management and Budget, saying they were working to remove asbestos and lead from the building to make sure they can keep employees safe, which also slows renovations like these down. In the end, the estimated cost of the renovation ballooned from $1.9 billion, which is what it was estimated at in 2021 to 2023, to $2.5 billion this year, or last year. That is a 30% increase. And now you see the head of OMB had accused Powell of inflating the price because he was installing rooftop terrace gardens and VIP dining rooms and elevators and marble features. In his response to that letter, Powell explained there were no VIP dining rooms being built. The VIP elevators weren't VIP. They were being expanded to better accommodate people with disabilities. The terrace rooftop gardens are actually an environmentally friendly runoff system that aren't being built to host people at all, and the marble being used is being salvaged or repurposed to match the existing building to stay in line with historic preservation standards. All of that is also laid out on the Federal Reserve's website, which, if you're going to commit a fraud, you're probably not going to devote a web page to explaining it, right? All of this is also pretty ironic, given the president's marble overhaul of the Lincoln bathroom, his engoldening of the Oval Office with $60 plastic molding from Home Depot, and the fact that he tore down an entire wing of the White House without approval for a ballroom that's cost has tripled since it was first announced just a few months ago. What experts and the Fed have been saying are the real culprits for the cost increase since 2021. It's unexpected work to make the building safe, the skyrocketing price of steel, which has not been helped lately by the president's tariffs, and replacing a lot of mechanical equipment to meet standards means working with a very old building that was built before, universal indoor plumbing and air conditioning. So all of that's hard, and it costs time and money. Now, all of that does seem to be pretty reasonable, even if the price tag on this is eye-popping. But it's just the cost of how this stuff works, and so far, there hasn't been any evidence of any kind of fraud. So what's really behind this? Well, Trump is unhappy with Jerome Powell. You see, Powell, along with the board of governors of the Fed, have the ability to raise or lower interest rates, and Trump wants Powell to lower rates much faster than he has been to give the economy a boost. You see, when interest rates are lower, borrowing money is cheaper, meaning people might have an easier time getting loans to start businesses or buy homes or cars or just have access to money in general, and in theory, that gives the economy a shot in the arm. Except lowering interest rates increases inflation, generally speaking. So it's the Fed's job to balance those two things so inflation doesn't get out of hand, but we don't make getting access to money so easy that it lowers the global value of the dollar. And Powell has been really hesitant to lower rates too fast, after we saw record inflation just a few years ago after the pandemic. And I know I'm sorry that we're talking some money math stuff here. I promise that's probably the last of it. But there's also one other reason that Trump would want to lower interest rates. Economists say that lower interest rates benefit the super rich more than anyone else. The way the Imperial Business School in London puts it is lower rates have a larger impact upon the value of assets than they do upon disposable income, and the wealthier have more financial and real estate assets. Simply put, they say when rates fall, it's households with the top 1% of income who benefit the most. Meaning, if Jerome Powell does what Trump wants, it's a windfall for Trump, his family, and Trump's friends and business partners. Because Trump views the presidency as a way to make more money. It's a pattern we saw in his first term that has been more consistent and more obvious since he took office a second time. So that gets us all the way back around to this fraud investigation. It's being run by former Fox News host Jeanine Pirro, now the district attorney for Washington, D.C., one of the most powerful prosecutor offices in the country. She said on Twitter today that her office had tried multiple times to get Powell and his staff to talk to them beyond the letters and the testimony that they'd already given and the website they'd put up, and those requests were ignored. So the DOJ opened an official investigation. She said her office makes decisions based on the merits, nothing more and nothing less, trying to take the president out of it. And the president also said at one point that he wasn't involved in this decision at all, although likely his displeasure with Jerome Powell and talking about fraud from Jerome Powell is a pretty good indication that he wants something done, but the president's still saying he had nothing to do with this. Now, the person behind the actual allegations isn't from the Department of Justice. He's a guy named Bill Pulte, and he's become something of Trump's attack dog when it comes to these kinds of investigations. Bill runs the Federal Housing Authority and has been behind the cooked-up allegations of mortgage fraud against some of the president's main political enemies, including New York Attorney General Letitia James, California Senator Adam Schiff, Fed Governor Lisa Cook, who has a case in front of the Supreme Court right now about her potentially illegal firing, and at least 4 other U.S. officials and members of Congress. Pay no mind to the fact that ProPublica found that Trump's own mortgages are nearly identical to the same ones he's calling fraudulent. But members of Congress and the markets aren't happy about this investigation either. The stock market fell when Powell made this announcement. So did the value of the dollar. And Republican senators came out of the woodwork to criticize the investigation, specifically targeting the DOJ here. Alaska Senator Lisa Murkowski said, quote, if the Justice Department believes an investigation into Chair Powell is warranted based on project cost overruns, which are not unusual, then Congress needs to investigate the Department of Justice. And Senator Tom Tillis from North Carolina, who is the head of the Senate Banking Committee, said this.
What do you mean about, do you think the White House is trying to stop the independence of the Fed?
Somebody at DOJ, I mean, the president said he wasn't in the mix. Another example of amateur hour as far as I'm concerned.
Do you think the president's...
So, amateur hour at the White House. And later, he told the New York Times if there were any remaining doubt whether advisors within the Trump administration are actively pushing to end the independence of the Federal Reserve, there should now be none. It is now the independence and credibility of the Department of Justice that are in question. Tillis has also said he's going to hold up nominations to the Fed until this whole thing gets fixed. And to wrap up here, that's what this fight is really about. Whether or not the entire government is under the president's authoritarian control or whether some of it gets to stay independent for the good of the country as they were designed. The Fed was designed this way in 1913, and it's meant to do that so presidents who have differing policy ideas, who can be mercurial, who can change on a whim, don't affect our wallets and the overall economy. And already we've seen the White House swallow up the independence of other agencies and branches of the government that are supposed to be a step removed from the White House. The Department of Justice, the FBI, the CIA, the SEC, the FCC, and the EPA, just to name a few, not to mention what appears to be most of Congress. So if Trump gets his way and gets to kick Powell out 5 months early, he'll likely appoint an acting Fed chair, which he can do without Senate approval. Meaning how money works from your budget to the federal economy to the global economy will likely be fully subject to the back and forth of Donald Trump. And now that still might happen, given Trump will be able to appoint a new chair in May, but at least then the Senate would have some say. But until this investigation is over, we just don't know what will happen next. All right, that is it for today's episode. Please rate and review the show wherever you get your podcasts. Like and hit the subscribe button if you're a watcher on YouTube. Leave a comment below. It really helps boost the show on that platform. Subscribe to the Make It Make Sense Substack. I've got a brand new piece of reporting coming up tomorrow. You're not going to want to miss that. And as always, share the show on social media. It's Mims News Pod. That's MIMS News Pod. All one word on every platform. I am at Grant Herms on Twitter and Blue Sky and at Grant_Herms on everything else. Thank you so much for listening today. I'm Grant Herms, and I'll talk to you on Thursday.